W.A.S.P outraged parents, religious groups, and even received death and bomb threats in the process. At the same time, they delighted people who witnessed their stage spectacles, led by imposing frontman Blackie Lawless, who stands 6 feet 4 inches tall. The group's 80s era albums represented a commercial high watermark for the group. In today's video, because you guys have requested it, let's talk about the unusual rise of W.A.S.P. The beginning of W.A.S.P's history begins with Blackie Lawless, who was born Steven Edward Duren in Florida. He was raised in Staten Island, though, and in his younger years, he befriended future Kiss guitarist Ace Frehley. Duren was brought up in a fundamentalist Baptist household, telling USA Today, "My father was a Sunday school superintendent. My grandfather was the head of the deacon of the church. When the doors open, I was there. I was indoctrinated. You're told what to think. I was in the church freely until the age of 18. And when I left the church, I really left. I went and practiced the occult for 3 years. At the end of that time, I discovered that was just another organized religion." In the same interview with USA Today, he also remarked how he had Jewish ancestry. As for how he got the name Blackie Lawless, he'd get the name, at least the first part of the name, by the age of 13. He told Eddie, "I know everybody in that band Trunk," that his mother worked for the USO during World War II, and she was a professional dancer during this time. She once went to a service club, and a guy one night went up to one of the sailors, took a switchblade, and stabbed the guy. He remarked, he took a switchblade and he stuck it in the guy in his stomach and walked around the guy with the blade in him, so he did a circle around his body. And I heard that story and it left a lasting impression. So with the color of the hair and all, it just stuck. As for the name Lawless, there was a player in the NFL from the Dallas Cowboys who was an all-pro center named Burton Lawless. Blackie loved that the jersey of the guy said Lawless on it, and that's where he got his last name from. Lawless's uncle was late Major League Baseball pitcher Ryan Duren, who played for a variety of teams, including the New York Yankees. Lawless even at one point considered a career in baseball, thanks to having a pretty good throwing arm. In the book Nothing But a Good Time, photographer and friend Don Adkins recalled how Lawless told him he had a 99-mile-per-hour fastball and got drafted to play for the farm team of the Detroit Tigers. But by the mid-70s, Lawless got an offer to join the group the New York Dolls and left baseball. However, I do want to point out in an interview with Louder Sound, Lawless would clarify that it was actually a stint with the Cincinnati Reds' farm team. And in a separate interview with Rough Edge magazine, Lawless claimed he still suffered from a pretty bad baseball injury, a torn tendon in his elbow. It wasn't just baseball that caught Lawless's attention, though, as he told the Edmonton Journal that had he not been a musician, he might have went into advertising, as he was always fascinated by marketing. Meanwhile, he'd tell a Dayton, Ohio paper that in his mind, the 3 best jobs or careers in the world were being the president of the United States, being a boxing heavyweight champion, and then, of course, being a rock and roll musician. He'd even meet boxer Muhammad Ali, who he credited as inspiring his onstage footwork. As I mentioned before, Lawless had a short stint with the iconic glam band New York Dolls, joining the group briefly in 1975 after guitarist Johnny Thunders left the group mid-tour. The Dolls taught Lawless how not to be famous, remarking to the Edmonton Journal, "They were the only band I know of that could sit at an airport terminal and miss 5 planes in a row. One member was drinking 13 quarts of liquor a day, and well, let's just say they were 5 guys trying to be Jim Morrison and succeeding." A lot of the early media coverage around W.A.S.P placed a pretty large emphasis on his stint in the New York Dolls, but for Lawless, the best thing that came out of that whole experience was that it got him from the East Coast to the West Coast in LA. Lawless soon formed the group Sister by 1976, which also featured future W.A.S.P guitarist Randy Piper. Now, I want to say that the biography that W.A.S.P's future label Capitol Records released to support their first album seems to have been fabricated to get a lot of press attention. According to Capitol Records' biography of the band, Piper had previously worked at Disneyland before working at a variety of fast food joints before being dismissed for unknown reasons. Then around 1978, a new lineup was assembled which included future Mötley Crüe bassist Nikki Sixx, as well as guitarist Lizzie Gray. Later, Chris Holmes joined the band, and Holmes, for his part, according to the band's biography, was supposedly found by the members after posing nude in Hustler magazine. And apparently his mother, according to the biography, was a Hells Angels member. Holmes later confirmed in an interview that the Hustler magazine story was completely fabricated by the band's label, And he also clarified that his stepdad was a member of the Hells Angels, not his mother. As for the band's sister, they dabbled in the same type of shock rock that W.A.S.P became synonymous for. Stephen Quadros, the drummer of the group Snow, recalled in the book Nothing But a Good Time, "I saw Sister one time at the Starwood, and I think it was Blackie. He actually set himself on fire, and it kind of went a little haywire. And the music was okay. It wasn't great or anything. But when he put W.A.S.P together, W.A.S.P was light years better than Sister." Lawless later started the band Circus by 1979 that also featured Piper. Lawless also had a short stint with Nikki Sixx in the group London. It was by 1982 W.A.S.P was finally formed, taking influence from AC/DC, Black Sabbath, the Beatles, Kiss, as well as Alice Cooper. But there was one interview that Lawless gave where he credited musician Arthur Brown as probably being his biggest influence when it came to his stage show. Brown was best known for the 1968 hit Fire. The band went through several bass players before Blackie took on the role himself while also doing vocal duties. Piper was also part of the group, and they'd enlist former Sister guitarist Chris Holmes and drummer Tony Richards, who rounded out the lineup. Richards, according to the band's biography from Capitol, was apparently thrown out of school after being found in a cupboard with a female teacher. He burnt the school's football equipment for good measure as a result. Holmes was a little hesitant, though, to join W.A.S.P, but Lawless assured him that they would nab a recording deal within a year or so. W.A.S.P soon set themselves apart from other bands in LA with Blackie's wardrobe and stage antics, which we'll talk about in a bit. As for what W.A.S.P stood for, well, depending on what mood Blackie was in, you'd get a different explanation. But generally, it was reported in the press that the acronym supposedly stood for "We Are Sexual Perverts." There were other suggestions that the press reported around 1984-85, including white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and war against socialist pigs. Another one that was mentioned in a paper I read was "We Are Satan's People." Lawless recalled in the book Nothing But a Good Time, "Our foundation wasn't theatrics. We didn't want to stand there and play. That wasn't us. Basically, it started out as entertainment for us. We quickly discovered that whenever you have the attention of eyes and ears, sight will always win over sound." But that's not to say that the music was an afterthought, because Lawless reported in several interviews that the music was also an important part. As for those stage antics and theatrics, it included Blackie's stage attire, as well as throwing meat into the audience or pretending to torture scantily clad women on stage, drinking blood from a skull, or lighting their name sign on fire. In fact, the members of the band had a friend who had a rich dad who was a heart surgeon, and they would go over to that friend's house who had a bunch of tools in the garage, and they would assemble their stage props and costumes there. Lawless admitted to the Toronto Star that when the band first got together, all the members were broke, so they couldn't go to clothing stores. Instead, they got a lot of their stage costumes from hardware stores and junkyards and then assembled it at that friend's garage. As for who these women were who appeared at their stage shows, they claimed they were all volunteers. You're maybe wondering where the group's stage theatrics came from. It was from the film The Road Warrior, with Lawless adding, "The whole Germination came from The Road Warrior. Nobody ever picked up on that. We were astonished. We never got busted." As for the press, they looked at the stage theatrics as clever marketing, even pointing to stories and rumors that Lawless removed the insides of several rats, but even those close to the band couldn't really see the bigger picture in the early days. Holmes recalled bringing his mom to a show where W.A.S.P opened for Warrior. He recalled talking to his mom after the show, recalling, "Chris, these guys sound 100 times better than you guys," which they are. But I go, "Mom, there's this one thing they don't got. The energy. We got the energy. You know, W.A.S.P, it was raw." That's not to say there weren't people who recognized what they were doing. One example was Ron Keel, who recalled in the same book seeing W.A.S.P, remembering, "I saw W.A.S.P at the Troubadour lighting stuff on fire, throwing meat at the audience. I thought that was cool because we didn't have meat. We had peanut butter and jelly. I'm like, wow, these guys are badass. They're throwing steaks." While Motley Crue was thought of being scary at the time, W.A.S.P seemed to take it to a whole new level. All the theatrics and buzz surrounding W.A.S.P in LA soon got record label attention. But surprisingly, W.A.S.P turned down the first offer they got from Shrapnel Records, which was headed by a guy named Mike Varney. W.A.S.P soon nabbed a deal with Capitol Records, and in a strange twist, the head of that label, Mike Varney, ended up co-producing the group's first album. They also ended up hooking up with Iron Maiden manager Rod Smallwood, who took W.A.S.P under his wing. W.A.S.P released their debut record in August of '84, but in the run-up to the album coming out, there was huge controversy over the inclusion of the opening track, Animal F*** Like a Beast. Capitol Records, wanting major retail outlets to carry the album, soon took the song off the record, and the following year the Parents Music Resource Center put the song on their so-called Filthy 15 list. The song was supposedly inspired after Blackie saw two lions mating on the cover of a National Geographic magazine.
You can't plan things like the PMRC in America, which is the whole thing about censorship, where they've gone on every major television channel, radio station in America, held up copies of our records, telling fans not to buy it, and in turn it ends up selling 10 times as many records as it did before.
The single was released in the UK through the label Music for Nations because, according to the Tampa Bay Tribune, the British government was so outraged by the name of the song, they threatened to jail 3 EMI executives if the label released the single in the UK. It soon became a sought-after import stateside, but the song would be included on a 1998 reissue of their debut record. There was a snippet in the Tampa Bay Tribune that for a brief period the song was the most requested track on an unnamed Philly station. The group's debut album tackled your typical youth topics like juvenile delinquency, while also covering more serious topics like violence and the occult and sex. What's amazing is that the first album virtually got no airplay on radio, so they relied heavily on MTV and, of course, controversy to sell albums. During the tour to support the record, they were also met with controversy abroad. It was during a stopover in Ireland, Lawless's codpiece with a 12-inch saw upset city officials, which resulted in the band's show at Dublin's TV club getting cancelled. Then during a stopover in Newcastle, the band was slated to stay at the Swallow Hotel, but once the hotel manager took a good look at the band, he cancelled their reservation. Then during a stopover in Nottingham, the group was protested by a Christian youth group who called the band evil and repulsive. On top of that, W.A.S.P was banned from performing in both Germany and Sweden because of their stage antics. In 1984, W.A.S.P appeared in the film The Dungeon Master and on the soundtrack to the film Ghost Warrior with the song Tormentor. I Want to Be Somebody was released as the lead single from their debut album, but it wouldn't chart in the States, but it did, however, chart in Finland, New Zealand, and the UK. They'd have another charting single in School Days in the same 3 countries. Of course, the press coverage focused largely on the band's imagery and the impacts it had on kids. Lawless told the Edmonton Journal that bands like his gave kids a way to vent their aggressions in an acceptable way. Lawless in one interview even referred to W.A.S.P stage antics as psychodrama, comparing their work to a modern version of Shakespeare. Once the band graduated to bigger venues like arenas, there were reports at the time that W.A.S.P's stage setup was so elaborate it cost $100,000 to design and build. It was designed by the same person who did Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom film, and featured a 7-foot skull with lasers coming out of the eyes and smoke pouring out of their nose. The group's debut album ended up peaking at number 74 in America and went gold. Prior to recording the band's second record, they changed drummers with Steve Riley, formerly of Keel, coming in. Lawless spoke to the Toronto Star and revealed that the band were no longer throwing meat into the audience or having female fans being apparently tortured on stage, with the frontman telling the paper, "I don't want us to get banned because some 12-year-old kid strings up his sister. Who needs that?" As for the lack of throwing meat in arenas, he'd add, "When you have a $100,000 stage set, a bit of meat's not going to make a hell of a difference unless you throw a cow out there." W.A.S.P released their second album, The Last Command, in November of '85. It made history, as MTV reported here.
All right, some music news for you tonight. The Last Command, W.A.S.P's new album, has the distinction of being the first record released with a warning label since the record rating campaign began. But
the warning sticker read, "Lyrics may be offensive to some listeners." Spencer Proffer, who produced Quiet Riot's breakout record Metal Health, produced the album, and in interviews, Lawless discussed how he wanted to experiment more with the album. It ended up peaking at number 49. 2 singles were released, included Blind in Texas and Wild Child, both of which only charted in European countries. Lawless seemed to sour, though, on the group's second record in interviews, telling a paper in 1987 that while he liked the compositions, he hated the mixes, adding that there wasn't enough guitar. He went on to add that on W.A.S.P's first album, he did about 80% of the production work, and for their follow-up, there were too many cooks in the kitchen, something he wanted to avoid on their third record. Randy Piper ended up leaving the band after their second album, and Blackie switched back to guitar with King Cobra bassist Johnny Rod coming into the group. In press following Piper's departure, Lawless compared their relationship to a couple going through a divorce. In 1986, the band released their third record, Inside the Electric Circus. Lawless later claimed in interviews it was his least favorite W.A.S.P album, telling the Warpo show that it was, and I quote, a tired record done by a tired band. Some of the reviews seem to indicate this too, especially for their live shows, which seem to have been toned down for the album. The record included several covers, including the 60s era song I Don't Need No Doctor, that's been covered by countless musicians over the years, including Humble Pie and Ray Charles. It also included a cover of Uriah Heep's Easy Living. The record peaked at number 60 on the album chart. By 1987, W.A.S.P put out a live record with one of the songs appearing in Ghoulies 2. By 1989, the band returned with their fourth studio album, and they lost drummer Steve Riley, who was replaced by Frankie Banali. Their fourth album, titled The Headless Children, took some inspiration from Iron Maiden, resulting in a more mature album. Politics and social issues are covered in the record. The album also included a cover of The Who's song The Real Me, a nod to the band's new direction.
One thing that I want to get across to people is that the image of W.A.S.P. and or myself for so long was this larger-than-life type thing.
Bloody, gory,
yeah,
cool thing.
Oh, that too, saw blades, you know, it looked like I stepped out of an ad for Black & Decker. But the things that we're trying to say now, that image can't say anymore. In other words, I've got to open myself up to let people see what's really going on inside me. And I thought, what a great way to say that musically. It's like, can you see the real me?
The album ended up being W.A.S.P's highest charting record of their career, peaking at number 48. It was following the record the band took a temporary break before reuniting in 1992. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.